Yep, I got the record.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, we're gonna start it.
Okay.
And as soon as it clicks to 7, I'll do the official welcome and turn it right over to you.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Here we go.
Mark, are you going to make your visit to the US as planned or not?
No, the flight's been canceled. I'm
Okay.
looking at other options for maybe
Okay.
December, but
Okay.
All right, I have 7 o'clock, so we are gonna get
Okay. Let's go for it.
okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Seth Katzen with the Jewish Federation of Delaware, and I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Julie for the introductions.
Okay. So, hi everybody. If we haven't met yet, I'm Rabbi Julie Danan here down in Sussex County. I'm with Seaside Jewish Community in Rehoboth Beach. And we are so excited to have someone joining us you can see from the Holy City, from Jerusalem, Mark Levy, who's a veteran journalist. He made Aliyah to Israel in 1972, and he's been as an expert on foreign affairs. He's reported for NPR, NBC, ABC, AP and CBC, not NBC. I think I've got all the letters right. But he's also an author. He wrote the book Broken Spring, published 2014, about the Arab Spring and what went wrong. And now recently, his most recent book is Why Are We Still Afraid? About how Israel has grown strong over the years, and yet there's still a lot of fear. And I'm very interested to hear how that might have changed over the past year. So I've been avidly reading Mark's articles online for a long time and corresponding and hoping we could bring him here. But for starters, it's great to have you here joining us on this webinar. Thanks for being here, Mark.
well, thanks, Rabbi Julie. It's been a long haul to get me in front of your people, and I'm really glad to be here. It's a pleasure. I guess I have already sinned in truth and packaging. I'm not in Jerusalem. That's just what the picture I took for my book. I'm in Rehovot, the other Rehovot.
Well, that's the best place to be.
There you go. It's if you don't know, it's south and inland from Tel Aviv, and we've lived here for 28 years. I'm in an office in my backyard. It's a little shack, which is where I do my writing and my broadcasting, actually, in the past. I have many hats. I'm a journalist. I'm an Israeli citizen. I'm an American citizen. I'm a husband, father, grandfather, Orthodox Jew. I even sing in the synagogue choir. Over the years, it's been a project, I guess, or a requirement for me to switch hats from time to time. Sometimes I'm a journalist. Sometimes I'm a singer. So often I'm a father and grandfather. This year, especially, it's becoming harder and harder to do that. You can understand why. This year has been traumatic for all of us. And so I think tonight I'm just going to pile them all up on my head. I'm going to let them all come together. You'll know who's talking, depending on the context, and chances are you'll see that everything kind of flows together. There are a couple of things I want to make clear before I even get started here. First of all, no matter what criticism you may hear of the Israeli government, and you will hear some, Hamas is to blame for all of this, not Israel. Hamas is to blame for the Israeli casualties, of course. Hamas is also to blame for the destruction in Gaza. Granted, it's been Israeli forces that have been doing it in order to try to root out the terrorists, and civilians have, of course, suffered as a result of that. But keep in mind, there was a ceasefire in effect on October 6th. Who broke it? Hamas, with a massacre that has been called a pogrom, and I've looked up the word and I've looked at the history. It's exactly what it was, a pogrom, and the worst terrorist attack that Israel has faced or that the Jewish people have faced since the Holocaust. So that's one thing. The other thing I need to point out is, though I do write for an organization called the Media Line, what I'm saying tonight is not representative of the Media Line, it's representative of me. It's my views, my conclusions, my analysis. But I'll preempt one of the questions I'm always asked when I give a lecture and we talk about the media, which is another lecture. I'm not doing that one tonight. And the way it mistreats Israel and the way it misreports the Mideast conflict and the way it gets practically everything wrong. And we're seeing that over and over and over again now. I have a lot of words for that. As I said, that's another lecture, but I just wanted to point out that the Media Line is a nonprofit organization. It's a .org. It has an opinion page, which is where I write, and it has news pages where I don't write. It separates opinion, even analysis, from news coverage. And the news coverage is fair and balanced. Don't want to use those two words together. It might have a context, but you know what I'm saying. It's an old-fashioned news agency. And if you're looking for something that represents reporting in Israel the way it used to be back when I started in the 70s, I highly recommend the Media Line. Take a look. It's themedialine.org. You can't miss it. So with that as a preface, here's what I'd like to talk about tonight. And I have to say that some of the material I'm going to show you and talk about is going to be hard for you to take. Well, imagine it's a lot harder for me to present it. These are things that have to be said and have to be shown. We have to know them. We have to know how to deal with them as best we can. First, I'm going to talk about what it's like to be an Israeli these days. Then, how Israel has handled the worst atrocity against the Jewish people since the Holocaust. And finally, where we go from here. And just as a teaser, so you'll stay around to the very end when I'm going to get into this, I have a way to define it away. Yeah, define it away. Now, so you don't have to look at my beautiful face in front of the Temple Mount for an hour, even though this photo is spectacular, though Rabbi Julie has pointed out it's a little off kilter. That's me and my camera doing the best I can, and I'll try to straighten that out for next time. I'm going to be sharing my screen so you can see some visuals. Please bear with me if I mess it up here and there. This is a lot easier in person, and I hope that next time, Bezrat Hashem, we'll be able to do this in person. So let me do a couple of clicks here and share my screen, and we'll get started. These last few weeks have been extremely difficult for Israelis. There were two assassinations of leading terrorists, one from Hezbollah, the other from Hamas, and Israel spent days waiting for Hezbollah retaliation, which kind of came and went, and we're still waiting for Iran's retaliation. What's especially upsetting about this is, as if it's a God-given right for these terrorists and terrorist supporters to retaliate when someone kills one of their terrorist leaders. Imagine how Israel should retaliate for the cold-blooded murder of 6 young unarmed civilians held in darkness for nearly 11 months for the crime of being Israelis. No one's talking about that, and instead we're hearing, oh, yes, the murders were horrible. Now let's have an agreement to stop the war in Gaza. And maybe, just maybe, that'll stop the war in Lebanon. That's usually ignored, the war in Lebanon, but Hezbollah has fired about 4,000 rockets at Israel's north over the past 11 months, and tens of thousands of Israelis are refugees as a result. What nation would put up with that? Would you? We'll concentrate on the Gaza conflict tonight, but Lebanon is just as serious. The toughest question you can ask an Israeli these days is the simplest. Ma shlomcha? How are you? It's been 11 months since Hamas terrorists overran Israeli villages like this one near Gaza, shredding Israel's pitiful defenses massacring more than 1,000 people and kidnapping more than 200 others. It's a trauma equal to even surpassing the surprise attack by Egypt and Syria 50 years ago, setting off the 1973 war. I'm the guy who wrote an article in September saying it's time to get over that trauma. Little did I know that there was another trauma about to take its place. So if you ask that question to Israelis, how are you? It sets off a conflict. Maybe they just had a birthday, or celebrated a wedding, or welcomed a new child or grandchild. Here's my oldest granddaughter getting married in July. She served in Israel's Navy. Her new husband is a Navy commander involved in conflicts on both borders. And if you look at the picture, my granddaughter is the young lady on the right. The guy waving his arm high above the crowd, the one with the glasses and little beard, that's her 22-year-old brother. He's an infantry officer. He got out of Gaza to come to his sister's wedding and went right back there, and he's still there. So we're back to our sad reality. October 7th hangs over everything. Many Israelis have lost friends or family members in the Hamas massacre and the war that has followed. Hundreds of thousands have served in the military. No one is untouched. Mixed feelings doesn't even begin to describe what's going on in our heads. The trauma doesn't come only from the deaths and injuries. It comes from the realization that the Israeli military, the one body in this country that had received automatic trust and support, let everyone down in the worst possible way. I have to point out very clearly, and I'll probably have to say this a couple of times, none of this is meant to downplay the suffering of Palestinians in Gaza over the past 11 months, or the blame for the deaths, injuries, and destruction on both sides that falls totally on Hamas and its Iranian sponsors. The Army's inquiry into what happened at Kibbutz Be'eri shows that how badly Israel's army failed on October 7th. Kibbutz Be'eri is right on the border with Gaza, and it was overrun. Thousands of terrorists began flooding across the Gaza border at 6:30 in the morning on a Saturday, Shabbat, also Simchat Torah. But Israeli forces didn't manage to enter Be'eri until 1:30 in the afternoon. For 7 hours, the overmatched, heroic, but tiny local militia battled the bloodthirsty killers and rapists practically alone. By the time it was over, 132 Israelis were dead and 31 others were taken hostage from Be'eri alone. A similar grim and shocking picture was developing in villages all along the border, as well as a nearby music festival where terrorists rampaged through the dancers, killing and abducting dozens. As residents cowered in their safe rooms, they pleaded one after the other, dozens, hundreds of times, "Where is the army?" The terrorists broke into most of those safe rooms, butchered and raped the civilians inside, burned many of the houses. All the while, the army was trying to get its act together. But here's the catch. There's nothing new here. All this has been well documented, reconstructed, replayed over and over again. The question the inquiry doesn't address is, why? And we're still asking that. So if you have to ask that question, how are you? Israelis are juggling whatever personal joys they've had since October 7th with an overwhelming collection of negative feelings: disillusion, anger, mistrust, and sadness. Disillusion over the failure of the Israeli military intelligence to grasp the significance of months of Hamas preparations, many of them out in the open, for the October 7th attack. We saw it on television over and over again. Hamas terrorists would storm the fence that divides Gaza from Israel over and over again. We saw video taken by Palestinian and or Israeli photographers of mock villages being built within sight of the Israeli border, and Hamas terrorists practicing how they were going to overrun the villages. And yet, we didn't take it seriously. It's inconceivable, but there it is. There it is. So disillusion is probably a nice way to put it. Anger is probably closer. Anger over the inability of the military to stop the attack once it started. And mistrust of the Israeli government over its clumsy handling of the war and the international crisis set off by the attack and by Israel's counterattack. But most of all, sadness. Sadness over the death toll that climbs every day as soldiers are killed in combat, over the fate of the 90 hostages still held by Hamas and its allies in Gaza, and now all the more so with the brutal, cold-blooded murder of 6 hostages, including Hirschfeld and Goldberg, by Hamas terrorists. This is not just theory. Mental health experts point to the troubling trends. Among the findings, 1/3 of Israeli women and 1/5 of men report high levels of traumatic stress, about double the level before the war. 1 in 4 Israelis suffer from substance abuse, again, about double the level before October 7th. The main problem, I think, is the expectations. A proper Israeli military deployment on October 7th would have resulted in the quick wiping out of the Hamas terrorists, most of them on the other side of the border, with minimum casualties among Israelis, both military and civilian. It's that simple. It really is. A proper Israeli military deployment means a couple of units of soldiers along this relatively short border, and ready for whatever happened, because it had already been happening again and again, as I said before. How is it possible that the Israeli political and military leadership thought it was a good idea to send people home for Shabbat? Practically everybody. How is it possible that the Israeli military thought it was a good idea to have electronic surveillance of the border area through cameras on the fences and internet and who knows what, and women soldiers sitting in a base near the border with their monitors, with their connections, and no weapons? Yeah, I'm angry too. Damn right I am. I know I'm a journalist. I'm supposed to be even-keeled. I'm not. Sorry. So the basic problem is that we had lived already with the lesson of the mistaken interpretations of intelligence warnings before the 1973 war, very similar to this one. Israel's figured they had the right to expect such a colossal failure would never happen again. Yet it did, almost exactly the same one. The Army's report on its own failures at Kibbutz Be'eri does not touch on that because it starts its examination on October 7th. Everyone knows the real failure was in the months and years before. Israel knew that Hamas was smuggling in weapons across the border with Egypt. Hamas even smuggled in a full-size tunneling machine of the type used to dig subways. There's no way Israel didn't know about that. Instead, Israel funneled hundreds of millions of Qatari cash to Hamas, assuming it would buy quiet, all the while knowing full well that much of that cash was going literally underground. Meanwhile, above ground, Gaza was being transferred from the dusty, downtrodden enclave I knew when I covered the territory in the 1990s to a mixture of new apartment complexes, like these ones in Gaza City. Fancy villas, shopping malls alongside the squalid refugee camps with their poor exploited Palestinians preserved for propaganda purposes and TV news backdrops. I can add that my friend and colleague Einat Wilf has written a book that I highly recommend for everyone to read if you really want to see where the Palestinians' heads are at and why they are. It's called The War of Return. It's available on Amazon. war of return. I have a slide of it somewhere. I'll put it up here if we have time. Just you'll get to see it. Now much of what you're seeing on the screen there has been destroyed. Not nearly as much as you've been led to believe by those news reports, but much. Also destroyed by the Hamas massacres are the idea of a two-state solution. Few Israelis would agree to a Hamas-led Palestinian state next door these days. And also destroyed are Israelis' faith in their own future. There are still dozens of hostages in the hands of Hamas. Some of them might be alive. The empty seats at this table at Hostage Square in Tel Aviv symbolize the tragedy, the anger, and the sadness here. You've had tables like this set up in places around the country and around the world. Hostage Square in Tel Aviv, which is right downtown, it's near the Tel Aviv Museum and Tel Aviv Performing Arts Center. Is a center of huge demonstrations demanding a deal to free the hostages in the face of government decisions or non-decisions. We'll get to that. Rebuilding faith is the most critical challenge facing Israel today. It won't begin till the war is over and the discredited military and political leadership is replaced. So that's the failure of October 7th. Let me emphasize once again, I'm not blaming, nor should anyone blame Israel for the atrocity, the pogrom. That's all on Hamas. And for those arguing for a ceasefire, as I said, there was a ceasefire in effect on October 6th. Hamas, not Israel, broke it. That said, here it comes. Israel has made just about every conceivable mistake in handling this conflict. Israel has done the impossible. It has painted itself into two corners at the same time. That really is impossible. But Israel has done it. By mismanaging the conflicts in both Gaza and Lebanon, you see where they are on the map here, Israel has put itself into two no-win situations. Neither war, in Gaza or Lebanon, should never have reached these corners. That indicates the real problem. The same Israeli leaders, political and military, who presided over the failure to stop the barbaric Hamas invasion of October 7th, 2023, are still in power. They're the same ones who have let the conflicts on the two borders drag on for 11 months. Instead of finding a way out, Israel plays into the hands of its enemies. Israel's military and society, actually the same things since the army relies on reservists, are not built to carry on wars for so long, much less wars on two fronts. Hamas, Hezbollah, and their sponsors in Iran know that. What Israel needed was a plan to wrap up the Gaza conflict in 2 or 3 weeks. Would that mean the destruction of Hamas and the elimination of terrorist groups for all time? Of course not. Given the failure of the government and military in allowing Hamas to arm itself for years with Qatari money funneled knowingly through Israel, and Iranian weapons smuggled across and under the Egyptian border, such a goal of total victory, as outlined by the Israeli Prime Minister, was never attainable. I can't think of a single war that has ended in total victory since World War II. Maybe Chechnya and Russia, but Russia basically destroyed the entire country in order to win that war. Now, I honestly can't think of another one. Vietnam ended with a truce. Korea ended with a truce. All of Israel's wars have ended with truces. Eventually, the final war with Egypt ended with a peace treaty, but not the war. The war ended with a truce. So if I'm wrong about this, I'll be glad to hear from all of you over there. If you are better at history than I am, I would really love to know if that's the case. But the total victory mantra has trapped Israel into an open-ended conflict against a terror group that already won the war with its attack on October 7th. They had won already. Hamas has cemented its place in Arab lore as the most effective anti-Israel force since the 1947 partition created the State of Israel. Make no mistake, Hamas is responsible for the atrocities, murder, carnage, rape, and kidnapping on October 7th. Israel is to blame only for its failure to prevent the assault, then its failure to free as many hostages as possible, declare victory, and get out of Gaza while there is still a chance of maintaining world sympathy and support. That support would have been crucial to get out of the other corner, the war in Lebanon. 11 months of Hezbollah drone and rocket barrages and Israeli counterstrikes have made Israel's north uninhabitable and created tens of thousands of internal refugees. As many as 90,000 Israelis are homeless. The internal refugee issue, a term that was used to apply only to Syria during its civil war, it now applies to both Israel and Lebanon. Unbelievable. There is no objective reason why Israel must face the Iran-backed Hezbollah terrorists alone. Every time they fire a rocket or launch a drone, they are violating UN Security Council Resolution 1701, passed in 2006, imposing a ceasefire then and requiring Hezbollah to move away from the border back to the Litani River. It should have been possible to enlist world support in stopping Hezbollah barrages before Israel's north burned. Who knows, perhaps Hezbollah would have acted on its own pledge to stop attacking Israel when the Gaza war ended. Instead, Israel's getting dragged into a months-long conflict gave time to the Iran-linked pro-Hamas groups around the world to ratchet up their protests, turning public opinion away from Israel and toward the beleaguered Palestinians, even though all of this is the fault of Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. So now what? There are ways out of this, but not with the present Israeli leadership. Netanyahu is constrained politically by the most extreme of his coalition partners, who demand an all-out war in both Gaza and Lebanon. The latter would no doubt trigger a Hezbollah missile attack that would kill many Israelis and cause considerable damage to property and infrastructure. Israel would survive, might even win, but the price of such a victory would be crippling. Cooler heads counsel signing a hostage for his prisoners deal with Hamas, pulling Israeli forces out of Gaza, even temporarily, and then deal with the Hezbollah menace. It might still be possible to get some world support for that, although frankly, I doubt it. Even then, the problems on both fronts would not go away, and without international intervention, future conflicts would be all but inevitable. Hamas would remain in place and then have its attacked tunnels intact, and as of now, there is no mechanism to keep Hamas from rearming. In Lebanon, Hezbollah is said to have 150,000 missiles to aim at Israel. I should point out that doesn't mean they could push a button and they all get sent in this direction at the same time. It doesn't work like that. And I also, frankly, question the figure of 150,000 missiles. It's like America having enough atomic nuclear weapons to destroy the world 17 times over. So what's the point of having that many, right? And it doesn't matter if it's 50,000 or 20,000 or 150,000. It's too damn many. And really, it's against the Security Council resolution, against the national interest of Israel, obviously, international interest of the Western world. And it's inconceivable that this happens without any international intervention. Only if the world wakes up and realizes that the targets of the terrorists is not Israel alone, but the West as a whole, that the perpetrators are not the local terrorists, but Iran, only then might world powers mobilize to put a stop to this dangerously escalating conflict. But even that scenario is unlikely unless there's a change of political and military leadership in Israel. I might be getting the idea I really believe that. I do. Give me just a second and lubricate myself with the water here. I don't know if you can see my screen or not. That is water, I trust. You have to believe me on that. The team that allowed October 7th to happen and then mishandled the wars on both fronts cannot be trusted to extract Israel from this trap with the minimum damage. That might be the most painful element for Israelis. They can't trust their government and their military to do the right thing. Once upon not long ago, that trust was a given. If you ask me, and this is the time to show you the cover of my next book, That's a joke, though my wife actually wants me to write it. So if you ask me, picture this. An American aircraft carrier group anchors off the coast of Qatar. It's pronounced Qatar, Qatar, Qatar. I'm going to go with Qatar because that's what most people understand, I think. The U.S. government instructs Qatar to handle over all the Hamas leaders it's harboring, or else. Once that is done, the U.S. government instructs the Hamas leaders in Gaza to release all the Israeli hostages immediately, including the dead, the two who just wandered into Gaza a few years ago, and the bodies of Israeli soldiers from a previous conflict, or else. Now picture this. An Israeli missile boat and several smaller warships anchor off the coast of Qatar. Israeli submarines make their presence known. The Israeli government instructs Qatar to hand over all the Hamas leaders it's harboring, or else. Once that is done, the Israeli government instructs Hamas leaders in Gaza to release all the Israeli hostages immediately, including the dead, who just wandered into Gaza a few years ago, and the bodies of the Israeli soldiers from a previous conflict, or else. Or else? Use your imagination. Now, picture this. An American aircraft carrier group and an Israeli missile boat accompanied by smaller warships anchor off the coast of Qatar. You know the rest. Is this scenario absurd, impossible, unrealistic? No, here's what's absurd, impossible, unrealistic. High-level pilgrimages to Qatar to genuflect before the rulers of a nation that has bankrolled and encouraged a murderous Palestinian terror group with the hope that the leaders of that murderous terrorist group will be reasonable. Israel is at fault for letting Qatar finance the terrorist tunnel network of Hamas, but it's Hamas and its sponsors who are fully to blame for the massacre, rape, torture, and mutilation of more than 1,200 Israelis and the kidnapping of more than 200 others last October 7th, as well as the damage and suffering that has followed Israel's counterattack. Testimony and evidence continue to pile up, documenting the atrocities committed by thousands of Hamas terrorists who crossed the border. There's a 43-minute video compiled from body cameras of the terrorists themselves, graphically and literally showing not only the atrocities, but the joy with which they were perpetrated, and the heroes welcome the terrorists received back home in Gaza. The video is available to the world, but not in Israel. The Israeli government, in one of the few correct steps since October 7th, decided its people were traumatized enough without seeing the Hamas horrors on their own screens. Now, friends, I have a 23-minute version of that video, and I've tried watching it, but I can't get past the first 2 minutes. It's that horrible. And I'm a journalist who has covered awful events like suicide bombings, Hamas suicide bombings, like this one in Jerusalem in 1996, near the Jerusalem open-air market. There I was with my microphone, walking carefully through the rubble, knowing the whole time it was possible that my 18-year-old daughter, returning to her army base that Sunday morning, might have been on that bus. She wasn't. She was on the bus just in front. She called from her base when she finally arrived safely. But standing next to me at the scene of that bombing is one of Israel's most outstanding journalists, Nachum Barnea. His son was on that bus, and he was killed. 2 weeks later, I ran into Nachum at the scene of another news event, and I asked him, Nachum, how can you keep doing this? He shrugged and replied, what else can I do? Sorry, it's been 30 years, nearly. My daughter is married with 2 kids, but this still chokes me up. Just give me a second. So, Qatar and Hamas, those are the partners in negotiations to free the hostages, really? Qatar is a peninsula that's usually described as a thumb extending into the Persian Gulf. A better description would be a middle finger extending out to the world. Besides bankrolling Hamas, Qatar is also the home of the sponsor of Al Jazeera, the pan-Arab TV channel that spews hate, filth, and anti-Semitism over the whole region, with no regard to minor qualities like truth. Al Jazeera is partly responsible for the wildly anti-Israel response to the Hamas atrocities. The Hamas itself is not the most popular kid in the classroom. The leaders of Hamas, many of whom started out in Gaza and fled to the riches of their exile, are kept in the luxurious style of visiting dignitaries, though the only actual accomplishments are killing Israelis and enslaving their own people. There's Ismail Haniyeh, who used to command Hamas from the Shati refugee camp on the Gaza beach when I know him when he was a lot skinnier, before he left for more comfortable accommodations. He met his end last month in what's euphemistically called a mysterious bombing in a guest house in Iran. Khaled Mashal, considered the senior Hamas guy these days, was once the target of a botched Israeli assassination attempt. These two and others keep the Qatar money flowing, plan terrorist attacks, and live the good life, while their people back home in Gaza suffer, mostly because of the many millions of dollars supplied by Qatar and others go underground for terrorist tunnels and above ground for rockets aimed at Israel instead of, say, basic infrastructure for Gaza. So, again, negotiate with Qatar and Hamas. You want ridiculous? There it is. Qatar is about half the size of Israel, half the size of New Jersey. It is almost totally surrounded by water. Military operation to seal off Qatar would take a few hours, if even that were necessary. Qatar has a tiny military with about 12,000 soldiers, a few ships, and a handful of fighter aircraft. The U.S. has a major military base in Qatar. So this is a military no contest, whichever of the three above scenarios is adopted. So, would Qatar comply with the demand to hand over the leaders of Hamas? Would the Arab world accept such an ultimatum? Would Russia and China? And most critically, would the U.S.? If we're taking this seriously, and this can be understood metaphorically, of course, not literally, metaphorically, we have to move to Plan 3, a joint U.S.-Israel operation, the tacit support and equal acquiescence of the others. The U.S. says and understands there are good guys and bad guys in Israel's fight. The bad guys are Hamas, Qatar, and Iran. Qatar can put an end to this war immediately by handing over the Hamas leaders. What happens to those leaders once the hostages are released? There are several options, ranging from summary execution to delivering to the International Criminal Court. Likewise, Hamas leaders still in Gaza, the bloodthirsty Yahya Sinwar, there he is, doing one of his more educational activities while he was still above ground. Now the leader of Hamas from his tunnel sanctuary, probably surrounded by Israeli hostages as human shields. The larger question is, does the U.S. want to restore its credibility as a power in the Middle East and the world? Or does it want to keep looking for a painless way out of crises by turning on its allies? There's only one proper answer to that, I hope. So let's sum up. This is Hostage Square in Tel Aviv again, and the chairs there have the pictures of some of the hostages on them. It's a must place for anyone who visits Israel to visit, to sample some of the pain and the agony and the strength of the people who are working to free their families and their relatives and their friends. All right, so here are a few points we can probably agree on. First, Hamas is totally to blame for the pogrom of October 7th last year and all the damage that has resulted from Israel's counterattack. Counterattack, folks, it's not retaliation, despite what you see in the media. I can do a whole other lecture about that. Next, Israel's failings follow on from that, ignoring intelligence warnings, leaving the Gaza border unguarded, depending too much on electronics and sophisticated devices when faced by a primitively but heavily armed enemy, and going back 10 years, believing Hamas could be domesticated or deterred by millions of dollars from Qatar. Next, prolonging the war to the extent that initial world support weakened and disappeared, leaving Israel alone to fight on two fronts. On the other hand, the US and its allies helped repel an Iranian attack in April. You remember, when hundreds of rockets and drones were fired in this direction. Only a few got through. Now there's a flotilla of American Navy ships in the region aimed at persuading Iran that it's not healthy to attack Israel again. It's an unprecedented show of support for Israel. And I think something we need to take account of, and we need certainly here in Israel, and we are to be very grateful for. Israel's president has released a very, very strong message of thanks to the Americans for doing this. But despite all this, Israel continues to defy American requests. Prime Minister Netanyahu flew to Washington to lecture the American Congress and its officials in the face of their requests for decisions. He did that before, you might recall, over the Iran nuclear deal. And that's another lecture. Here's the main lesson. A government, any government, is elected to make decisions easy or hard. Israel has refused to do that. I won't go into the reasons, but rescuing all the hostages and eliminating Hamas once and for all are incompatible goals. It just can't be done together. But Israel has not made the hard choice. It has also not made the hard choice about how Gaza should be administered after the war, so there are no long-term goals, and the military is chafing under the fact it doesn't know what it's fighting for. Likewise, Israel maintains the outdated us against the world, we don't need any help posture. If it was ever true, it isn't now. Iran is a threat to the Western world, not just Israel. Iran is behind Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, who have been paralyzing Red Sea shipping for months with precious little opposition from the West. Israel needs to develop its alliances, not alienate its partners. How do we do that? And here it comes. Maybe we can define this problem away. Instead of calling this the Gaza war, let's call it the latest Gaza battle. Israel has been fighting Hamas in Gaza for more than a decade, 2 decades really. This is the largest battle. Much has been accomplished. Total victory can be a long-term goal. We can end this battle now, even without admitting that we lost it, which we did. Declare a ceasefire, get as many hostages back as we can, and live to fight the next battle, which will inevitably come, no matter how long we prolong this one. That's the way out, the way toward restoring some balance, restoring crucial alliances, restoring a sense of unity in Israel. But none of that will happen until the leadership, civilian and military, is changed, totally replaced. The argument that you can't change leaders during a war is an excuse, not a solution. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis filling the streets of Tel Aviv last night cannot be ignored. So to answer the question we're discussing tonight, is Israel in danger? Here it comes. In 1933, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt declared, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. In Israel of 2024, I'd say, the only thing we have to fear is ourselves. And I'm going to stop here.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. There's your book.
There's
Your
my
latest
book.
Are We Still Afraid? And thank you. And I want to make sure I thank Seth Patson and everyone at the Jewish Federation for co-sponsoring and for facilitating this, and also our president of Seaside Jewish Committee, Larry Crever, and our board, who've been so instrumental in tonight's program. But we still have time for Q&A, because I think that this fascinating, riveting, and sometimes wrenching talk has given us a lot to think about. So we have some questions coming up in the Q&A. And first got one from George Beckerman about where are the Saudis in your calculus? Do you think the Saudis have a role to play?
The Saudis have a critical role to play in the future of the Middle East. There's no question about it. And there are continuing reports that Saudi Arabia is prepared to normalize to some extent relations with Israel. in exchange for a promise that Israel will work toward a two-state solution. Well, I wrote an article a while back that says who's afraid of a Palestinian state. And the reason I'm not afraid of a Palestinian state is it's not going to happen. Israel has offered the Palestinian state, the Palestinians, an independent state in the equivalent of all of the West Bank, all of the Gaza Strip, parts of Jerusalem, and a corridor through Israel to link the West Bank and Gaza. It's about 20 miles, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And Palestinians have twice turned it down. If you read that book I mentioned before, called The War of Return, you'll see why. Because they do not want a two-state solution. They want a one-state solution, and they want us gone or dead. That's the fact. So Saudi Arabia can definitely play a major role here. There's a realignment going on in the Middle East. I'll try to keep this short. As I say, it's another lecture. Between Iran and its allies, mostly Shiite Muslims on one side, and Saudi Arabia and its allies, mostly Sunni Muslims on the other. Ironically, Hamas is Sunni because Palestinians are almost entirely Sunni Muslims, but that's technicality. I think that once this, it's obvious where Israel fits, right? With the Sunnis and the Saudis, and there's already been a major step in that direction with the Abraham Accords. Israel now has peaceful relations with several countries in the Gulf, Persian Gulf, and this is a start toward a coalition with the participation of the United States, maybe NATO, to a coalition that I see one day imposing a solution on Israel and the Palestinians, drawing a border, policing a Palestinian state to make sure they behave themselves, and also policing us to make sure we do, which is not a problem. I see it sometime in the future. How long in the future, who knows, because these days what used to take 50 years takes 10. But so there is a long answer to a short question. Yes, I believe.
And I think that was actually, you anticipated one of the questions because you started out with the Saudis, but we had a question about, about a two-state solution. So you've addressed that.
Yeah.
So we had somebody asking about, well, put it this way. I mean, there has been some I would say almost conspiracy theory ideas of Netanyahu wanting the war to save himself from indictment, but I think there's been some more maybe reasoned speculation that he's prolonging the war to stay in power, to avoid indictment. What do you think this has anything to do with what's going on?
I don't pretend to see inside his head. I don't know. You probably noticed even in a situation like this, I like to laugh, and it's one of my tools as a journalist is to trade jokes with people. In that book there that you're looking at the cover of, there's an anecdote about trading one-liners with a Hamas leader. There are very few people who don't respond to that, and he's one of them. He really doesn't like me. Not because of what I write, he really doesn't like me. He's a highly intelligent fellow. He has a trigger mind, a great grasp of concepts and details, and he really wants to stay in power. I don't think this has to do with the trial. He's facing charges on all kinds of minor and less minor corruption stuff, and it's as far as I'm concerned, pretty small potatoes. But in order to stay in power, he has to mollify the most extreme elements of his governing coalition. I can give another lecture about Israel's political system, but to make a long story short, if you have 25% of the vote, you're probably going to have the largest party and can form a government, but it has to be a coalition government. And in this case, he has a majority of 64 out of 120, and he has to keep everybody happy, including the ones who are the most extreme. There are those who say that he's doing that against his better judgment or just in order to stay in power. There are also those are saying that they're doing his dirty work and he really believes in it. I don't know which is the case, but this is the political situation we have today. Until seeing an estimated 500,000 people on the streets on Saturday night, I don't know if that number is accurate or not. It's a bit like the 150,000 rockets.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't matter if it's 500 or 400 or 300,000. It's a huge, huge demonstration, and it's almost not political. These are people who say we want the hostages. We don't care about killing a few more terrorists, right? It will take a handful of members of Knesset to say, okay, enough of this. We're pulling the plug on this coalition. We're going to either have a new government or have a new election.
Well,
I don't see it happening.
That leads to the next question. Someone asked, when do you think there will be elections? Or what?
As I understand it, the election, the next official election is set for early 2026. Normally, Israeli governments don't serve out their entire terms. As you might recall, we had 4 elections in 2 years not so long ago. And normally the governments fall because of not important issues, and not the ones you would think would bring down a government. Yitzhak Rabin's first government fell because the American Air Force delivered fighter jets to Israel on a Friday, and one of the fighters decided to do a little loop-de-loop to show the thing, and it got to be Shabbat, and the religious party pulled out of the government. We had an election. So it's hard to say. It's hard to say. I myself am amazed that they're still in power. Amazed, but they are. And I can't really say when they'll.
With all that's happened. And I guess a follow-up from the same person, as far as Netanyahu, would he dispute the facts as you describe them? And again, that's kind of asking you to get in his head. So, but are the facts sort of the facts?
Yeah, the facts are the facts.
Yeah.
He believes well, he has gone publicly and said that holding on to the border between Egypt and Gaza, well, it's called the Philadelphia corridor. It has nothing to do with the city, but it's a Philadelphia. I don't know why it's that. Which is where Hamas dug tunnels underneath in order to smuggle in all of the weapons and like that, and also bribed the Egyptian border guards to let them get that tunnel machine, various other things across the border. Says holding on to that is existential.
Yeah.
Well, why wasn't it existential for the last 14 years then? I mean, Israel controlled the Philadelphia corridor until it pulled out of Gaza in 2005. So, why? I'm sorry. The throw around the word existential a little bit too freely for my taste. So I guess he wouldn't agree with
your interpretation.
Wouldn't agree with my analysis.
Yeah, your analysis.
Sure, but the facts are the facts,
Right.
Facts.
Yeah. And just to clarify, it wasn't the same person asking. It was two of our wonderful Leslies were asking questions. Well, the next question, why do you think that? Well, you spoke about the Saudis a little bit, but Saudis, Egyptians, could they be exerting more influence? Do you know, or do you think Egypt's playing a role for good or for ill, or could be doing more?
Egypt, those of you who don't, well, how would you know this? I spent 2 years living in Egypt and working at the Associated Press editing hub in Cairo during Arab Spring. That my first book is about that. So Egypt is important to me, and living there and getting involved in what's going on led me to understand how important our ties with Egypt are and how varied they are.
Mhm.
And it seems to me to be a no-brainer that the way to control the Philadelphia corridor is in cooperation with Egypt instead of pissing them off, which is what we're doing. Egypt doesn't want Israeli soldiers on the border. Fine. So we'll continue to work behind the scenes as we've been doing since time immemorial, especially with the present government, to control the ISIS elements in Sinai. And they're doing a hell of a job of it with our help. So let's do it that way, if it isn't too late.
No, thank you. So I actually came with a couple of questions myself. One of my big questions, I guess, especially as a rabbi or anyone who's active in the Jewish community, is what do you see as a helpful role for American Jews and American Jewish leaders to take? Because there's so much anti-Israel sentiment, and including anti-Semitism, that's been proliferating. So we are advocating for Israel, but at the same time, there are many Israelis who are saying, speak up for what's, the very things that you've said now. Speak up for those people that are demonstrating against the government and to make a deal for the hostages. So how could we be helpful when, over all the years we've been told, well, let the Israelis make the decisions. What do you think?
I will be the last one to try to dictate to Americans or even suggest to American Jews how they should react to things in Israel. I think there are a number of things to guard against, not the least of which is that the squeaky wheel gets the oil.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, the most extremist and loudest among us, who
Mm-hmm.
are tiny minority, are getting much too much press attention, if you will.
You mean in Israel, people in Israel?
No, in America.
Okay.
I know there are Jews who are radically opposed to the existence of Israel. They're probably, what would you think, 1 or 2%? You're there,
I
I'm
don't
not.
know the percent, but
But anyway, I know the
yeah,
vast majority of
yeah,
okay.
right, a very small minority.
Here
Yeah.
is an example of what's happening in today's climate.
Yeah.
Social media built up the pro-Palestinian demonstrations that were going to overwhelm the Democratic Convention in Chicago.
Right.
We were going to see hundreds of thousands of people. That's what it said on Twitter. That's what it said on Facebook. That's what it said on Instagram. And the buildup was immense. And it was a total fizzle.
Mm-hmm.
So folks, keep your eye on the ball here. Get off social media. Get out there in the community. And I should talk, right? I'm on social media a lot, but then I'm retired. I can do that.
Well, my other question for you is sort of ties in with your latest book, Why Are We Still Afraid? About Israel growing stronger and yet having the baggage, having the fears, since 1973, et cetera. But how do you see that right now? I asked you this a little bit before by email, but I could think, I'm not going to name names, but let's say some pundits who are followed by American Jews use the term, we have an existential threat. Our very existence is being threatened by all these different fronts. So how afraid should we be? Should Israelis be afraid? Should we be afraid? And do you reinterpret or you stand by what you said?
That is, of course, the title of this lecture is Israel in Danger.
And the answer
and the answer to my
yes.
As I said, how did I put it there?
The only thing we have to fear is ourselves.
Is ourselves, yeah. That's a guy who like to come up with things like that. Yeah, we can screw this up. We can. I think it's a mistake to consider Hamas as an existential threat. Iran is to some extent, but we seem to have, at least for now, the Western world on our side there. We need to make sure that we keep it that way. Again, if the question is, can Israel stand up against the entire world by itself? No. And if that's what we're trying to do, then yes, we will be in danger. I don't think that's the right way to do it. I don't think we have to do it that way. As I said, probably 19 times in the space of this 45 minutes, believe we need new leadership in order to do that. Frankly, I don't see where that leadership's going to come from. The folks in that photo of the demonstrations, they wanted to get rid of the entire government, the entire Knesset, anyone who had any connection whatsoever with anything, going to start over from scratch. Right? That's unrealistic, but that's what a lot of people want. So again, existential is something that happened in 73. We came that close to getting pushed into the sea. I was here then, okay? I was a 26-year-old a radio broadcaster working for Israel Radio's English service. I was from the time that air raid siren went off on that Shabbat, Yom Kippur, until a couple of weeks after the war ended, I was in the English news department. We worked 8 hours on, 8 hours off around the clock. And we had, that was me, right? Yeah, I lost 25 pounds from my playing weight. I looked like I was the one who actually had a picture of me sitting next to a guy who had been held as a prisoner of war in Egypt, and you couldn't tell which of us was the POW. Anyway, that's why I keep an extra 10 pounds on me these days, just for those reasons. That was existential, no question about it. Had President Nixon not airlifted at the last minute, replenishing supplies and warplanes and tanks and whatever, we could very well have gone under. We can't now. We won't now, because we have second strike capabilities as well as first strike capabilities. I won't go too much into detail. I'm probably not supposed to. Use your imagination. I mentioned submarines before. So, you know, we're not going under. We're not in danger of being overrun. But life can be bloody unpleasant over here, for sure. And that could still happen.
Thank you so much. And thank you very much for this very thoughtful, interesting, provocative talk. And Seth, do you want to say something in conclusion?
Can I take 5 more minutes of your time?
Fine with me.
Something else
Yes,
to say.
go for it.
All right with you guys? Okay,
Yes.
I'm gonna do my screen sharing thing here if I can. And let's do that screen. Okay, I mentioned this to Seth already. What I wanted to say was, I'd like to end on a personal note. My birthday is Wednesday. Yes, 9/11.
Wow.
Yeah. And as I told Seth, I'm going to be 47. No, I'm not. One of my kids is also 9/11, and he's going to be 46. So you can do the math. The 7 is right. For the first few years, when people heard that my birthday is on 9/11, the date of the worst terror attack the United States has ever experienced, they tissed in sympathy and said things like, "What a shame that you can't celebrate your birthday anymore." Well, I always used to say I got there first. But that started petering out after a few years. 9/11 receded in memories, or it was just history. For example, except for the one that just got married, and she was 3 months old, all my grandchildren were born after 9/11. Several of them never heard of the attack on 9/11. They do have a pretty good excuse, of course. They live 7,000 miles away from New York. But it's a common reaction now. 9/11 is just another date in history. If we want to teach or learn about it, first we have to explain what happened. All the more so when it comes to the Holocaust. For me and my generation, it's real. My parents were Holocaust survivors. I grew up with the Holocaust. But even my children knew of it from a distance. When my son was 16, he asked permission to go on a school mission to Poland to see the death camps and learn about the Holocaust. I was livid. No son of mine is ever going to set foot on that graveyard of millions of Jews, I declared. Then we discussed it, and he persuaded me that for his generation, it's important. My son is about to turn 49. His oldest daughter, as you already know, just got married. So when I see polls that show that 20% of American youth don't know even the basic facts about the Holocaust, I have the opposite reaction to most people. Only 20%? That's pretty good considering how long ago it was. I don't mean pretty good. I mean, we have a lot of work to do, and it starts from the beginning, teaching what the Holocaust was, who was targeted, and why. Likewise about Israel. It's no surprise to me that youngsters over there can swallow the story that Israelis are colonizers from Europe. Have we taken care to teach them that Jews have lived in the land of Israel continuously for 3,000 years? That when you do archaeology in Israel, you dig up ancient artifacts inscribed in Hebrew? They won't know unless we teach them. And not only Jewish youth, who need to know this backwards and forwards, especially non-Jewish youth. Do we expect Black youngsters to know that Jewish leaders marched alongside Martin Luther King for civil rights? That was 60 years ago. It's not enough for us to complain to each other on anti-social media. We have to reach outside our circles and educate. I'll leave that there as a challenge for all of us.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Rabbi Julie. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Mark, you gave us a lot to think about, and we appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Everybody
for
have a good
taking the
evening.
time. Thank you.
Good night, all.
Thank
Night.
you, thank you. Glad we could do this. Hope things will be more peaceful in the new year, in the coming year.
Amen. Amen. Yevatzon.
Okay.